Salmon Wildlife Federation. We are so excited to join you from across Canada and around the world to learn about salmon today and waterways and watersheds and all the important things that are a part of environmental conservation in our country. Learn about salmon today. I had a little bit of feedback in the background, but it's all taken care of now. As we get our microphones ready and ready to share and learn today, we have a question. We've been answering it a bit in the background here live in the meeting, but if you're just joining us now on YouTube, you have a chance to type in your answer. So the question is, how many eggs can a single spawning Chinook salmon lay? Now our guest speaker today, he'll let us call him Nick, but I mean, the people he works with call him Dr. Lapointe because he is a doctor in ecology and conservation. I think he can clarify exactly what he's a doctor of, but it is not of probably fish fins. I don't think he treats fish for like doctors. No. But
my grandmother used to think that's what it meant. But,
so
I have done surgery on fish.
Oh my goodness, I can't wait to hear about that.
Transmitters. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that.
But before we get started, I want to welcome all of our friends. We have classes joining us from across Canada: Toronto, Calgary, Sylvan Lake, Spruce Grove, Edmonton, Kelowna, Lake Country. So from coast to coast, we have classes here today. And we won't probably have time for everyone to say hello, but I will sort of let the classes that are here in here to maybe wave, and if they have someone who wants to come up, that would be wonderful. But before we get started, I'll just do a virtual land acknowledgement. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we are meeting on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge the importance of the lands in which we all call home. And we do this to affirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. And then from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation peoples that call this land home. And I think salmon is an amazing conversation to have when we do land acknowledgements, because salmon are such an important part of our Canadian culture and Indigenous cultures across Canada. They are, I think, what's called a keystone species. And Nick will correct me if I'm wrong in that use of the word, but it means that they're like critical to Canadian life and have been a part of our culture as a country for time immemorial. And so I'm very excited to help you guys learn and celebrate this very important part of our environmental community and ecosystem. Now I see we have friends from Kelowna and Toronto and Bayview all joined us in the classroom today. And then I know we have many, many more who are logged on right now to our YouTube, because I see them in our chat. And so I want to, if we have our friend from Bayview who wants to come up to the front if they're ready to say hello.
Hello, we are Bayview Blind Toronto, and we are happy to be here to learn about salmon.
Wonderful, thanks so much. And then do we have a friend in Mr. Izzard's class in Kelowna who would like to come up and say hello? Oh, yeah, I can see you. Almost, just need to unmute. I can see you there. I can ask you and you can see if it helps. Does that help? It was working. Oh no, okay. Well, hello, Mr. Kelowna. Hopefully you guys can type a little welcome. And then we have Reese who's joined us from Black Falls. Hello, Reese. And okay.
Hi.
And so, hello, Reese, welcome. Okay, oh, Nick, would you like to to introduce yourself and get us started on this wonderful conversation? But maybe first you can start off with our answer to a question. How many eggs? We have guesses of 2,500. We have 173. Someone on YouTube says 1,300. The Chinook salmon, how many can a female lay in a season?
A little bit more than all of that. They're our biggest salmon, and I'm going to introduce you to them in just a minute here. But on average, you might look around 5,000, 7,000, depending on how big those fish are. And the biggest
7,000.
ones might get up to 20,000.
20,000. That is a lot of babies to be responsible for. Good thing they don't have to have jobs.
It is. There's other fish species that we'll also talk about very quickly here, like American eel, that can lay over 1 million eggs when they go to spawn. So you know what? But it also depends on the size of the egg. So salmon eggs are fairly big. They invest a lot in each egg, and that's why they don't lay millions at a time. So it's kind of a trade-off between how many you lay and how healthy or big or successful those individual eggs might be.
Amazing. All right. Thanks for the answer. And good guesses, everyone. Thanks for answering.
Thanks. So my name is Nick Lapointe. I'm a fishery scientist. I work with the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and I lead our freshwater program. I do a range of research, advocacy work, and implementation of conservation projects. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research we're doing in the Yukon here. But first, I want to give a background on Chinook salmon themselves, and then a little bit of background on fish passage, and then we can talk about that research project. So those are sort of the three main things I'll talk about today. So what we can do is start out by talking about Chinook salmon. So these are the biggest salmon that we have in the world. They're sometimes referred to as king salmon. In French, it's very similar. It's saumon Chinook. And it's Chinook rather than Chinook. Some people, even though it's spelled with a CH, it's not chin. Their scientific name or Latin name is Oncorhynchus chawacha, and everyone might pronounce that a little different, but chawacha is just the name for Chinook salmon in Kamchatka because they're native to both Russia and Eastern Asia as well as North America. And this is an example of a very big Chinook salmon, close to as big as they get. This one's probably 85 pounds. They might get up to 100 pounds, but there's very, very few of those large salmon left. Most Chinook salmon are smaller than that these days. They're an anadromous species, which is really important when we talk about fish passage because it means they migrate between freshwaters and the ocean. So they are born in freshwater. That's where their eggs are laid. Once they hatch, they swim downstream to the ocean where they spend about 3 to 8 years growing up. And at the end of their life, they come back to spawn, and they do that once. They go back to where they were born, they spawn, and then they die. And that's why they're called semelparies. There are some salmon species like Atlantic salmon, which is not closely related, but in the same family. And Atlantic salmon are iteroparous, which means they can spawn, go back to the ocean, and come back the next year and do that 2, 3, or 4 times in their life. All of these Pacific salmon are native, as I say, to sort of the northern part of the Pacific Ocean, all throughout Asia and North America. And there are 5 species, Chinook being the largest of those. There's also chum, sockeye, coho, and pink salmon, the smallest. And at the end of their life, when they come into fresh waters, they change color. In the ocean, they're very silver. They start to get on this reddish color in fresh water. And the males, if you've ever seen a salmon with that big hooked jaw, that's the males. And they only develop that when they come into fresh water to spawn. Chinook are different from the other species in that they have a stream type that will actually not go to the ocean right away. They can overwinter their first winter, and they're found up in the north and far inland. When they do make it to the ocean, they go far offshore, and they come back into the coast several months before they come in to spawn. There's also an ocean type, which is more in the south or in the tributary streams that are really close to the ocean. And just like the other salmon, they'll go out the same year that they hatch. They tend to, when they live in the ocean, they stay close to the coast, and they come back in right when they're ready to spawn. So what's neat about salmon is that when you get into a river, a huge river like the Yukon River, every little tributary, so every stream that comes into that river, like the branch of a tree, can have a completely unique population. And those populations might only have 1,000 individuals in them naturally, or a few thousand, or even a few hundred. There's 100 different populations just in the Canadian waters of the Yukon River alone of this species. You can also have runs that are separated in time. So up north, you only have one run usually, but where it's warmer, you might have a spring run that comes in and spawns in the spring, and then a whole different set of fish that come in the fall and spawn. And down in California, there's even 3 runs, one that comes in the winter as well. So because those fish spawn in different places and different times, they don't breed with each other, and they actually are almost like individual species. And it's really interesting, but it's also really challenging because we have to conserve every one of those units if we want to maintain the full abundance of Chinook salmon in a river. To talk quickly about other migratory fish, I won't spend a lot of time on this. So the anadromous fish that I mentioned are salmon. They're born in fresh water and grow up in the ocean. There's also other fish like shad or striped bass that do that. In North America, there's one catadromous fish, which is the opposite of that, and that's the American eel. And American eel are actually born in the ocean, and as little babies, they swim upstream into fresh water, where they'll live for up to 20 years before making one trip back to the ocean to spawn. And then within fresh waters, these are fish that never go to the ocean. We also have some big migratory fish like lake sturgeon that can travel hundreds of kilometers when they go to spawn. But other catadromous fish include suckers, pike, walleye. So those of you that are in Alberta or Ontario, there are migratory fish there as well, and fish all across the country really need open rivers to be able to move back and forth between places, not only that they go to spawn, but they might live in a different habitat in the winter, in the summer, when they're young, when they're adults. Fish need to move throughout these systems to be able to be successful.
So I don't.
And that's where these. Go ahead.
So we have a question that's just coming off YouTube from a student in Alberta, and they want to know, how do fish find their ways? Like, how do they get there and back without a map or GPS?
It's a great mystery, and we know some of it, but not all of it. And we've learned this through experiments. We know that salmon in particular really cue in, especially once they get into their rivers. They can actually smell where they were born. You know, that particular landscape, the geology, the river, the stream where they come from, they have a smell that they remember, and they follow that up the river to the point where they start getting close to their branch. They'll actually stay on that side of the river and orient on that side of the river because they're recognizing that the smell is stronger there. But fish will also use magnetic fields, you know, a whole bunch of other cues that we don't understand really well. And we can tell that by isolating fish and giving them just a little bit of information and seeing what they respond to and not. So we've run different experiments to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. So cool. Sense of smell. Amazing. Thanks.
And a lot of times we just have no idea. American eel, we don't know what draws certain individuals up into certain areas because they can migrate 3,000 kilometers, 4,000 kilometers as little tiny fish like this, and we don't necessarily know what's driving them or how they figure that out. So along the way, fish run into barriers, and some of these are natural, things like falls. This is a set of falls down in Virginia, and there's actually brook trout above and below those falls, so we don't know if those trout, maybe humans moved them above, or maybe they've been there since before those falls cut their way into the side of that mountain, so millions of years in this case. There are beaver dams and log jams that fish can get around, or you know, maybe some of the fish can pass, but not all of them. And you might have heard in the news about the Big Bar landslide on the Fraser River in BC a couple of years ago. This whole side of the mountain just carved off and fell in here, and has created one heck of a drop that makes it very difficult for salmon to get past. So people are working to help fix that as we speak. And then we have a whole bunch of human barriers. We've got these big mega dams that are obviously very hard for fish to pass, but lots of these little low weirs or low head dams that can be really problematic. And if you're ever driving around in a car and you go over a stream, a lot of times you go over a bridge, but many times it's a culvert like this. It's just a pipe that goes under the road. And if that pipe's not installed properly, you can get into situations like this where fish can't make their way through it. So all of these things can really break up those highways, break up those migration routes, and keep fish from getting to the habitats that they need to complete their life cycle. So what do we do about it? Well, you can do things like you can remove the barrier. So this is a great example of a road that had a culvert that fish couldn't get through, and they've taken that culvert out and put a bridge over it instead. And now you have a nice natural stream under the bridge. We're just starting to take out some big dams. This is the Elwha Dam in the US, and for a long time, people were trying to get it taken down. You can see someone painted a crack on the dam to try to get some support for getting rid of this dam that was no longer generating power being used. And about less than 10 years ago now, they took that dam out, and now you can see it's recreating a native system, and you're seeing salmon and steelhead come back into that river. If you can't take the dam out, you can install a ladder. There's a bunch of different ladders or fishways. The term fishway encompasses ladders and other ways of getting fish around barriers. And those can be small or large. You might have fish swim into a trap and then essentially have an elevator that lifts them up in that water and lets them go on the other side of the dam. Or you can have more nature-like fishways, these rocky ramps that would help get fish through a barrier that was otherwise impassable. Here you can see there's one of those low head dams, and there's this great bypass channel that was dug. And a big difference between the fish ladders is those fish ladders are usually designed for one species, like a salmon, where we know their swimming ability and their size, and they can get through it, but other species can't. Whereas these natural bypass channels, typically a wider range of fish species can get through them. But as great as fishways are, they don't always work as intended. Just because you put a fish ladder in doesn't mean that 100%, even of the fish that you intend to get through, make it through. Even if they do make it through, they can get delayed at the base of that. And a salmon that's migrating from the ocean to its spawning grounds has a ticking clock. It has a few days, a few weeks to get there. If they get stuck and can't figure out how to get through a ladder for several days, that can use up their energy. It can create stress in them. And it may mean that even if they pass that ladder, they don't make it to their spawning grounds, or they don't spawn successfully. So it's really important, if you do install a ladder, to test it, to make sure it's working properly, and to keep making improvements to it until it passes most of the fish that you want it to pass. So the last thing I want to present on then is a project I keep mentioning, the Yukon River, which is one of the biggest rivers. I think it's the 5th biggest river in Canada. It has one of the biggest populations of Chinook salmon in North America. And those Chinook salmon make the longest known migration for salmon. They travel over 3,000 kilometers all the way across Alaska, all the way south through the Yukon, and into potentially even, we've found some individuals going right into BC through that river network. And we're focused on one spot here in Whitehorse. So this is a great highway because there's no dams along this entire river. There are a few on some of the tributaries, but not on the main branch, until you get all the way to Whitehorse, where there's one power dam that's been there since the 1950s, and it's had a ladder that's passed fish operating since 1959. But we haven't, in that whole time, known a lot about how well it works. We know how many fish have passed through it, but we've never really assessed how many fish, what proportion of fish that want to get through make it. So this is a project we're working on in partnership with local First Nations there, especially Carcross-Tagish First Nation, with the power company, and with Carleton University. It's being led by a PhD student that I'm supervising or co-supervising, named Will Twardick, and he's prepared these slides that I'm borrowing from him to share with all of you. Because what we've been seeing, not only in Whitehorse, but throughout the Yukon River, is drops in the numbers of Chinook salmon that are coming back over the past decade or so, that are quite concerning, to be honest. So this was an area that historically, above Whitehorse, First Nations people there, best we can tell, probably harvested about 10,000 salmon a year. There's 200 or 300 families that would walk over 100 kilometers with all their gear to go and smoke fish and have those fish for the winter and bring that back to their communities. But since the 1950s or so, the average number of fish that have come back is only about 1,200. And, it's not clear why. What we do know is that those numbers had dropped before the dam went in. So it's not like before the dam was installed, there were still, there were 10,000 fish. And then as soon as the dam showed up, there's only 1,000. But we're not sure why that population hasn't been able to recover. So if you look at this Whitehorse hydro plant a little bit, this is the dam. There's intake channels and powerhouses over onto the side, over on the side here. This is a spillway where the extra water comes through, and you can see the ladder moving along beside the dam. And those salmon climb up the ladder, get into the reservoir, and then continue along their way. And this is actually the longest wooden fish ladder in the world. It's been operating continuously since 1959. So we wanted to know what proportion of fish that are approaching this ladder are actually able to pass it. And we wanted to get a better sense. We have a good sense. We want to get a better sense of where these salmon go after they do pass the ladder. Where are their spawning grounds upstream of Whitehorse? So here's a couple of other looks at the ladder. You can see sort of the steps that they go up. It's a vertical slot ladder. If you look here, there's a big weir. That doesn't look that big, but that weir is about 3 times as tall as I am. And those big Chinook salmon, every now and then they can force their way up through this water and swim through it. They couldn't jump. The height would be way too high for them to jump. But what this was built for is this whole weir was built just for the ladder. The entrance to the ladder is right over here. And what they're trying to do with this this weir is keep fish from going up to that spillway that I showed earlier and not being able to find the entrance to the ladder. So this keeps them from going any further. And as they explore along the face of this, they find the mouth of the ladder. And halfway up the ladder, there is a viewing chamber. So this is a tourist attraction. If you ever go to Whitehorse, you can go. And these windows actually look into the ladder. You see here above is right above that viewing chamber. So the picture on the right is the top, and the picture in the middle is the side view of that. And this little space above the viewing chamber is a place where we can capture those salmon, measure them, count them, and then let them go on the other side to continue their journey. So what we do though is we want to tag these fish before they get to the ladder. So we go out and we set a gill net, and I'll show a little video here of what that looks like. So you go out and you set that net across the current, and you wait for salmon that are swimming upstream to come in and get caught in the net. And that's Will driving the boat there. He's the graduate student. So this is what Will is doing for school. He's going out and setting a net for salmon. And the crew there then sits and watches that net, just like if you're ice fishing, you're looking to see it bob, because if a fish goes into that net, we don't want it to die in the net. We want to get out there. The second that fish gets in the net, we cut the fish out of the net. We don't care about our net. We do everything we can to handle that fish as quickly as possible and get it back into the water as quickly as possible. Because every minute that fish is being held, it is stressed out and it runs the risk of being injured. And we're trying to, handle this fish as little as possible, both for the health of the fish and to make sure that us handling that fish doesn't change its behavior when it later goes and approaches the dam. So what we do is, these are both live healthy fish, as much as right now they're immobilized. Will is implanting a tag, a transmitter, inside the stomach of the fish. And because Chinook salmon, when they come into fresh water, they're coming to spawn and die, they actually stop feeding. So if we put a transmitter in the fish's stomach, it's not going to digest it, it's not going to block it from getting any other food, and the salmon is not going to pass that and excrete the tag with its excrement because it's no longer passing food through its system. So it's actually very quick to just put a rod in there, let the tag go in the fish's stomach, actually right around here, and let that fish go. We can handle these fish basically in under 2 minutes. And anytime they're in the boat and not being handled, they're in a tank of water with a whole lot of oxygen being pumped through to keep them happy and healthy. And we release them right where we caught them. This is about what the transmitter looks like next to a quarter. So fairly large transmitters, but the salmon are large as well. And so the way it works is when we put that transmitter in a fish, that transmitter pings about once a minute, and that fish just then makes its way up the river. And you can see up here a map of the river. Every place there's a white dot, we've put one of these receivers in. And what happens is if the fish comes anywhere close to that receiver, even within about a half a kilometer, the receiver will pick up that ping. And that ping is like a series of beeps. It's a code, like Morse code, that lets us know what fish it was that we tagged came by that receiver and when. So we put all these receivers out, and basically they tell us whether or not the fish was close to that receiver and what time of day and how long it spent there. So we can then sort of recreate the movement path of that fish. And so we can see this fish is trying to find its way up past the weir. It gets into the ladder, makes its way up, maybe trying to figure out how to get past that viewing chamber, and eventually all the way up the ladder and into the reservoir called Schwatka Lake. And then from there, it can go on through the rest of the Yukon River. And so, you know, here we're trying to figure out what happens at the dam. So here's the mouth of the ladder. The ladder goes here, kind of goes through this little turn, a U-shaped turn. Each one of these little lines that you see is a step in the ladder that the fish has to swim up. There's the viewing chamber, and then once the fish goes past the viewing chamber, they continue on into the lake. So we don't have any information about what that fish is doing over here in front of the spillway. We only know what that fish is doing when they come close to one of their receivers. And I said earlier, you could hear those fish 500 meters away. Close to the dam, we can barely hear those fish at all because the water is so noisy. The sound of the water interferes with the sound of the tag, so we really only pick up the fish if they're right next to the receiver. So here's a little video of what these fish look like. As they approach, we're here sort of midway through the spawning period, and we've got a blue fish that comes, hangs out near the ladder entrance a bit and doesn't find its way in. And then a beige fish that made it into the ladder and stopped at the viewing chamber for a while is just sort of holding there. Green fish took a while to find out how to get into the ladder, but once it got into the ladder, it shot through, and there the beige fish turned around and went back. So it made it to the viewing chamber, but not all the way through. And before we did this tagging study, we just assumed that all the fish that showed up here, there's a camera in the water. If you saw fish down here, the assumption was that all those fish made it through the ladder. Now we're really into the migration season. You can see lots of fish coming through. And I think the video stalls there. But you get a sense of what it looks like when we recreate our data of these fish moving through the ladder. And then we can look at what happens to these fish after they pass the dam. So this is the dam here. And then as you go up the Yukon River, they get to this big lake called Marsh Lake, and the main spawning river, the McClintock River and its tributary Mitchie Creek. This is where most of those fish go to spawn after they pass the dam. And so we can recreate their movements. Now, we're kind of estimating what happens between these receivers, because once a fish passes this receiver, we have no information on it other than how long it takes to get to this receiver. So here it looks like all these fish are traveling in a straight line, but it might be that once they pass one of our receivers, they actually bounce back and forth or pause and then swim really fast. We kind of only know where they go and where they end up. So you can see these male blue and female red fish moving upstream through that system. So what we're trying to do is figure out those patterns of how these fish are moving through the ladder. You can see there we're finding maybe parts of the ladder where those fish are getting hung up, like close to that viewing chamber. So maybe we can change, the structure of the ladder there, or when that viewing chamber is open to help fish move through. And once they get into the ladder, make sure they get past. And then further upstream, we're trying to figure out all of the spots where these salmon go, where they might spawn, so that we can make sure that we either protect or restore those habitats, or help to reintroduce salmon to habitats where they used to spawn but no longer exist today. So that's my presentation. There's always lots and lots of questions, so I thought I would leave some time for that here. And I'm very happy to go back to any of those slides or take questions from all of you about Whitehorse, about fish passage, fish ladders, or salmon themselves.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I learned a ton about the movement of fish and everything. We do have questions. We have a bunch on YouTube, and I'm sure I can see students moving around in classrooms right now to ask questions as well. I'll bring one up. Maybe we'll go to Bayview. I see they have a little line. So we'll start with Bayview, and then I'll seed in some others from other places.
Hello. I was just wondering, we have a river behind our school. It's the Don Valley River in Toronto. And we have salmon that come through, but we're not sure what kind of salmon. Would you know?
I missed part of your question because it cut out. I heard you talking on river. What did you want to ask about them?
Behind us, we have the Don Valley River, and some salmon migrate through it during the year, but we're not sure what kind. Do you know?
Oh, what kind? Well, historically, there would have been native Atlantic salmon in the Don River and in all the rivers around Toronto, but they were wiped out around the 1900 because of overfishing and because of habitat loss. So we really changed all those rivers. And there used to even be seals in Lake Ontario that would eat those salmon, but those seals were wiped out as well. So big loss. But what's happened since then is a lot of salmon have been reintroduced, and actually some of those Pacific salmon were introduced into the Great Lakes. So I think in the Don River, I'm not sure, but I think what you're looking at there is probably Chinook salmon. There may be some stray Atlantic salmon because some of the Atlantic salmon have been reintroduced in the Credit River, for instance, and the Ganaraska River. But I don't know what's making it into the Don River itself. I would say almost certainly some of them are Chinook.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. And we have a question from YouTube on why do the salmon change colors, and how do they do that?
I don't know how they do that. I really study more sort of fish behavior and conservation. So some of those physiological changes I'm not necessarily aware of. But you can think about there's some different things when they're out in the ocean. They need to be a color that protects them from predators. You know, orcas really like to eat salmon out in the ocean. So they need to be a color that makes it really hard for them to see. And when they come into freshwater, that silver color is no longer as, you know, they don't want to be bright. At the same time, a lot of those salmon turn bright red when they come in, especially sockeye salmon. Sockeye salmon are super bright red, and especially the males. And what you're dealing with, if you think about like a peacock, right? A lot of animals in nature turn bright colors when they spawn or mate in order to show that I'm so strong that I can make myself bright and susceptible to predators and still escape them. And they're trying to be attractive to their mates by showing that even though they're bright, they still survive. So I think that's what's happening with those salmon changing colors in freshwater.
That's so cool. Oh my goodness. I hope you're ready, Nick, because there are so many questions. We're going to go to one to Kelowna, and then we'll go back to our friends in Toronto. So Mr. Ezard's class is, how can fish climb ladders without any arms or legs? How do they use those muscles to get up?
Yeah, so I almost put a cross section of the ladder in my presentation, but I didn't. Ladders are designed in a way where there's basically they make it so that the current is slow enough in parts of the ladders that fish can swim up it, but those fish have to push. They have to swim as fast as they can to make it up those little steps or slots or whatever else. And then there's a spot right beside that where the current swirls around and those fish can rest. So typically what ladders are is they're a series of resting spots and flowing water that's flowing just slow enough that fish can push through it. In other spots, if you've ever looked at salmon trying to make it up waterfalls or rapids, they jump. But ladders typically aren't designed for jumping. So fish don't have wings, they don't have arms, but they can swim and they can jump.
And that ties, sorry, I'm just gonna, before we go to Bayview, that ties into a YouTube question, is how high or how far can they jump?
It depends on the species. Again, pink salmon aren't great jumpers. Chinook salmon, steelhead, and Atlantic salmon are really great jumpers. You could look, and it really depends on what the current is like and what the runway is, how deep it is below that step. But you could picture a salmon jumping about 3 meters, 10 feet, something like that, if the conditions are right. So they can be pretty impressive jumpers if they need to.
That's amazing. I can't even jump 10 feet and I've got legs.
Yeah, not at all.
Awesome. All right, our friend at Bayview, I know you've been patiently waiting. Oh, perfect.
How do the fish jump?
Oh. How do they what, sorry?
How do they jump?
Well, they basically swim really fast under the water because it's really their tail is what's making them go really quick. And it's almost like if you've ever taken a Matchbox car and sent it down a ramp, right? That car has enough speed coming down the ramp that when it leaves the ramp, it flies up through the air. So if a fish swims as fast as it can, does a burst of energy to swim as fast as it can, and points itself up out of the water, then when it leaves the water, it just keeps that speed, just keeps it flying like a rocket as far as possible.
Amazing. All right, we have another question here from Miss McNabb. Do fish at the ladders, do fish communicate with each other about how to get it, or is it really like a lone man's game and everyone for themselves?
That's a surprising question that has been studied by researchers, and they don't communicate in the traditional sense or intentionally. And they don't communicate like a school, but they do release pheromones. Pheromones is like it's kind of like a smell. It's something that, you know, we're as humans not really good at detecting, but fish are really great at detecting. And so, especially if a female fish makes it up that ladder, is part way up the ladder or above the ladder, then the male fish that are trying to get to the spawning grounds, they can smell those pheromones coming from that female down the ladder, and that will really attract them to it. So, you know, if you don't have any fish going up the ladder, it's very hard for the first ones to make it up. But once a few start to make it, the others can basically follow their trail. So that's the form of communication that they have.
That's so interesting in that sense of smell, because it's not what I would traditionally think of a sense of smell. You know, it's not like they've got pig noses or people noses, elephant trunks, right? Like they're in the water. And so for me, it's just such a different way of thinking of smell.
Yeah, and it's not even smell like we would think of. You know, it's not like something smells sweet or something smells rotten. It's more of a signal. It's more of information. It's a different sense that they have that we don't really have in the same way. So it's as different as seeing and smelling from us. I think that detecting pheromones versus smelling food is different for them.
Awesome. So we have a question here in the chat from Lynn, who's on the meeting. Lynn, did you want to unmute and ask yourself? If not, I'm happy to do it for you. I'll give you a second, Lynn. All right. The question was, what are some of the predators of salmon in the north?
Yeah, well, it all depends on the age, right? So those young salmon, as they're out migrating, they might be eaten by northern pike. They could be eaten by lake trout or whitefish. Any of the other fish in the system would eat those small fish. The eggs, other salmon can eat their eggs. Insects would eat their eggs or even eat the small fish. And then certainly birds, you know, kingfishers, osprey, eagles. As they get out into the ocean, they start to face things like sharks, especially orcas, dolphins, you know, any big fish or mammals out in the ocean would eat them. And then when they turn around and come back upstream and get back into the river, then their main predators are humans, obviously, those eagles and osprey again, and the bears, the grizzly bears and black bears. And anytime you get to a salmon stream, you will see lots and lots of eagles and grizzlies and black bears all around feeding on those salmon.
Yeah, I bet. Oh, I see a friend over at Bayview Glen is lined up and waiting. Come on up.
Do fish swim in packs or by themselves?
It depends on the species. When they do swim together, you call it a school of fish. And typically out in the ocean, those Chinook salmon would be swimming in schools. And the schools give them a lot of protection against predators. So it means when you're in a school, you've got lots of eyes to watch for predators. And it's really hard for the predator to chase those fish because they get confused by how many different targets they have. You know, you can think of small fish and minnows. So if you look over in Toronto Harbor there, you'll see lots of schools of small fish that do that as well to escape predators. If you think about a fish like a northern pike that's found throughout most of Canada, those are really a solitary fish. They're a lie-in-wait predator, so they're a long torpedo-shaped fish that sits there very still, like an alligator does, just as an individual. And when they see something they want to eat, they burst forward like a torpedo and chase that prey and eat it. So some fish are solitary and some school.
You there's oh, that's actually one of the questions is how many from a school in Calgary, Miss, I think it's Bisiak. I'm gonna say that wrong, but anyways, her class is wondering how many species of fish, because it sounds like it's like depends on the species. How many species are there of salmon?
Well, it depends what scale we're talking about. If we're looking at freshwater fish in Canada, there's about 200 species of freshwater fish in Canada, including native and introduced species. We're a cold country in general, so that's quite low in diversity. Very hard for many fish to survive in this area. When you get down into the tropics, there can be many more. There's probably about 10,000 species of freshwater fish around the world, and at least another 20,000 species of marine fish. There's far more diversity in the ocean, but probably many more than that we just haven't identified yet. So lots and lots of species of fish that we've never identified, and even some, what we're finding now, even in Canada, is that it might turn out, if you look really closely, that something we thought was one species is actually, genetically different enough to be considered two different species, depending on what part of the country you're in. So we're still uncovering those more subtle differences between fish species.
Interesting. Nicholas, I know you're on the meeting from Toronto. Do you want to unmute and ask your question of Nick? You had a great one here. I can ask you to unmute, Nicholas, so you know I'm talking to you. All right. I might just jump in with it. So how many years do fish spend in the ocean before going to spawn? Or does it, again, depend on the species?
It completely depends on the species, because a lot of fish, only live in the ocean. But if we're talking about salmon, the Chinook salmon would typically spend between 2 and 6 years in the ocean, plus that 1 year that they live in the stream before. So basically, by the time they spawn, they're either 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 years old. That's the range of ages when they come back to spawn. What we've seen in the Yukon River over the past 40 or 50 years is we've completely lost all our 8-year-old fish, and we rarely ever see a 7-year-old fish now. So what we're seeing is the age sort of 3 to 6 is much more common. And that's really unfortunate, because typically those older fish are the biggest fish as well. And we don't really know what's causing that. It could be a couple of things. One is that if the conditions in the ocean are changing, they may be pushing those fish to come back and spawn at an earlier age, or essentially killing off all the ones that are genetically going to wait until they're older. But the other big influence is fishing. So the fishing nets in the Yukon River use a really big mesh size, and they're targeting those largest individuals. So we've been selectively taking all those oldest and biggest fish out of the river for decades, for over a century now. And we may actually be removing the genetics for fish to get old and big, and that's why we're seeing younger fish. And we're actually seeing that across the range of salmon. So our salmon are getting smaller and younger, and it may be because of how we're fishing them.
All right, so I'm going to ask a question, and then I'm going to go to Bayview, and then Reese, if you wanted to ask a question, you can. So you're going to be third, but you can also say no, thank you. But I wanted to give you a chance because you've joined us here. So first me, and then Bayview, and then Reese. So there are a lot of questions coming in on the chat here and on YouTube about eating. What do they eat? Do they smell their food? And why do they stop eating when they're coming back?
Yeah. So eating is a big thing that drives this life history. So they spawn in freshwater, possibly because that's where they came from. They evolved in freshwater. But those freshwater systems, especially on the coast in mountainous areas, don't have a lot of food in them. So there's a lot of pressure to those. There's a lot of advantages if those fish, as young salmon smolt, they might eat plankton, which is like little microscopic animals and plants. They might eat a few insects, but by and large, what they do is they get out of the ocean where there is much more food out there for them, and especially ocean plankton at those younger ages. And then as they get bigger, they start eating small fish. And so, they get, if they make all that effort to get out to the ocean, there's tons and tons of food, and they can grow from this big to this big in 3 years. It's an amazing amount of growth. So there's a big advantage for them to make that long, long journey. What they do in the ocean is they pack on all kinds of growth, all kinds of food, all kinds of energy that they turn into two things: eggs and swimming ability. And so by the time they make it back to fresh water, they have everything they need. They have all the energy they need to make it to their spawning grounds and lay their eggs and fertilize their eggs. And there's just not a lot of food for them in those fresh waters. And it would take a whole different, it takes energy to get food. You have to go and chase them and so on. So it's just better for them to get all of their food energy in the ocean and then stop feeding and dedicate themselves to get back to their spawning grounds. And yes, they can smell their food. That's one of the ways that they hunt, through sight, through feel, and through smell.
Amazing. All right, Bayview, over to you. You have to come up nice and close. Yep.
Is fishing for food bad?
No, but it's really important to only harvest so many fish that the rest of the population can replace them. So people have always eaten fish. Fish eat fish. It's okay if you don't want to eat fish, but people across the world eat fish, and a lot of people really need fish as their source of protein. That may be, whether you're talking about indigenous people that have always relied on those fish, or people in developing countries that don't have easy access to protein. Fish protein is one of the most important sources of protein for humans. What we have to do is make sure that we don't have too many people eating too many fish in one spot where the fish don't have enough babies to replace themselves. So eating a few fish is good. Eating too many fish is bad.
Yeah, I mean, is there the risk? Because we know adults know what's happened to the cod fishing industry in the eastern coasts. And for those who don't know about that, it's just that, like Nick was saying, too many people were fishing at the same time, and now there's a large problem, and they've had to put limits on how many cod can be fished. Is there that risk here with salmon in the west?
There's a huge risk, and it's been contributing, across the Yukon and British Columbia to declines in salmon numbers. And the same thing, and I mean, this happened before the cod fishery. There were collapses in the salmon fishery in BC, and then the cod fishery collapsed, and still we're overfishing those fish. And that happens even though we have good science, good information on how much fishing is safe for those populations. The problem is the people who are fishing push hard. They push very, very hard to be able to keep fishing, and they don't have a lot of alternatives. And those fisheries and the government regulating those fisheries doesn't always do a good job of limiting how many fish people are taking or how big fish people are taking. And unless they do a really, really good job of that, then overfishing contributes to some of the declines that we see. And that is happening.
Yeah, something to really think about. Okay, Reese, do you have a question?
Yes, I do too. We both have a question.
Sounds great.
How fish migrate?
Well, they basically are swimming up or down a river, depending what direction they're going, the same way a highway is. So instead of just hanging out in the river and looking for food, they're traveling. They can travel a big salmon would travel 50 kilometers a day, every day for weeks on end, along that river, along that highway. So it's basically like they're going on a big, long hike to get to where they want to be, and they're going in one direction to get there.
Because from Black Falls to where they go, because he was saying 3,000 kilometers. So from Black Falls, that's like you getting in your car and driving to Disneyland. That's how far they can swim.
Oh my God.
Amazing, hey? Yeah. All right, over to your brother.
What type of salmons have big predators?
I would say all of them, especially when you get out in the ocean, and the big predators are really the orcas. Those are the biggest predator. And in fact, because we've seen such big declines in our Chinook salmon numbers, the biggest salmon there is Chinook. We're the main prey for those orca, and we're actually seeing that orca are not doing really well. They're getting very thin. They're not getting enough food because there's not enough salmon in the ocean for them. That's actually been a big problem.
Well, sorry, Reese, we have so many questions, but thank you so much for asking those too. So we have another question from in here. Do other fish sometimes use the ladders? if they're intended for salmon, what happens when other fish try to use them?
Yeah, we definitely see other fish in there. We don't necessarily see fish like northern pike, even though those pike would sometimes, they're not migrating, but they're dispersing. You know, they might be going to find a new home in another part of the river, not every year, but at some point in their life. And they're just not good swimmers and they don't make it up. But if you go into that viewing chamber, you'll see whitefish in there. You'll see grayling, which is in, both of those are in the salmon family, but they like look quite different. A grayling has a big fin on the back, but they're all smaller fish like this, and they will use that ladder as well to move back and forth. Neither of those fish is a migratory fish in the same sense that salmon are, so they're just using that ladder as a way of moving up and down the river.
So interesting. So one of our friends who's here in the meeting was doing some research on their own on Google and was telling me all about, had found a fossil from 50 million years ago of a salmon. It's like an amazing picture. So if any of you guys are interested in Googling that, it's a pretty cool picture. But it relates to another question that came off YouTube that is, do salmon have ancestors and what did they evolve from?
Ooh, that's a good question, and I think there is debate. I'm really scratching at the extent of my understanding here, so don't quote me on this. I don't know for sure how long ago they evolved, or where, or how many times, because as we say, the Pacific salmon and rainbow trout and cutthroat trout are all very closely related. They're in the same genus, and Atlantic salmon and brown trout that originated in the Atlantic Ocean are in the same family, but in a different genus, along with all the other trouts and the whitefish and the char and graylings and so on. So all of those came from one family, which means they came from a common ancestor, but they're found throughout the northern parts of the world, and some migrate and some don't. So that I'm confident about. The life history of salmon moving to the ocean. I think, I could be wrong, but I think the understanding is that these were freshwater fish that found this extra, through chance and evolution, found this extra source of food in the ocean, and that life history developed. And that's happened not only to salmon, but other fish many times. So you'll actually see with brook trout, for instance, which are a char, unrelated other than in the same family to either of those salmon, when they live in streams that are near the ocean, you'll have some of the fish that stay in the stream and other fish that are completely different, same species, but they grow much bigger, they go out to the ocean, they turn silver, and they migrate back inland. So, and lake trout in the Arctic do that. So there is an evolutionary advantage to developing this migratory behavior, a huge evolutionary advantage, because it evolves separately over and over again. We see fish doing this independently without any common ancestor. Doing this over and over again.
So I mean, we are quickly running out of time. It's amazing how 20 minutes of questioning can go so fast. But this one kind of relates to what you were saying and came from one of our friends off YouTube. Isn't it weird for fish to be in freshwater and saltwater, because they have a fish tank? And it's very important that you have saltwater fish in a saltwater tank and freshwater fish. Like there's no sort of like jumping in between. So is salmon unique that way, or is it very common? They're more used to one or the other.
They're not unique, but all of those diadromous fish do that, and it takes them a long time. You can't take a salmon from the ocean and drop it in a stream. It would die. It would not be able to transition like that. They have to go through that physiological change as they mature. So it takes over a period of weeks. They move close to the coast. They sit in that estuarine water that's sort of part salt water and part fresh water, and their bodies change to be able to process fresh water instead of salt water. And the same thing happens when their baby's going to the ocean. So it's always a gradual process, and they need the time to be able to make that change. But it's something that they can do that mammals can't, for instance, that we can't. It's a very different, especially because they're so, they breathe that water in over their gills. They're constantly eat that water with their food. They're constantly taking in salt water when they're in the ocean and fresh water when they're in fresh water. So it's quite a transformation they have to go through.
Amazing. All right, so we have time for one last question. I know, Reese, you wanted to ask a question and I jumped to the others, but we'll let you ask our very last question of the day. How does that sound, Reese?
I just said thank you for saying it.
Oh,
you're very welcome.
Thanks, buddy. maybe we should end on that then. Thank you, Nick, for joining us today and for sharing all of your knowledge from fossils to babies to fish ladders in the whole sort of ecosystem and lifespan of fish with us, and salmon in particular. It was an amazing talk. There's lots of comments and thank yous and everything coming in on YouTube and here in the chat. So it was wonderful having you with us today. Thanks to all of our students from across Canada, from Toronto all the way to BC. We enjoyed having you here today. Goodbye, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone, for all your questions.
Thanks, Nick.